Misha here, and this is a video, or rather, the first of hopefully many videos I've been wanting to do. Well, sort of. Just to cut the long story short, a building that my family owned got sold, and there was a like storage shelving thing that I took out of it, and I've been using it here at the cabin just to put projects on, gun stuff. But everyone keeps thinking it's a display because I have, some guns there, some models, some figures, whatever. So I finally decided, okay, if everyone's looking for a display, I'll make a display. So I've been slowly bringing out my space models and space toys. I've collected them for a very long time, and that will be my display. So with them out here, I'll be able to do a series of videos. I've already covered the Chinese space program, and I've covered SpaceX, so I've covered the modern stuff. But I want to go back to the beginning. Okay, not the true beginning. I've long since wanted to cover Russian spacecraft and history, and I've never been able to find Russian models or toys or anything until now. I think I might have found some. They're on order, so cross fingers I get them. And then we'll talk about Russian stuff because it is fascinating. But for now, we're going to revisit Project Mercury. And we're going to talk about pretty much every aspect of it, from the hardware used, the launch systems, the boosters, the capsule, and the space suit, and the astronauts themselves, and the missions. And we're going to begin, for now, arbitrarily, with the model I've shown you before. This is actually a cool little mahogany desktop model I bought a long time ago, and I bought 3 different ones of these. I bought this, I bought the Titan for Gemini, which is really hard for me to say, and I bought Saturn V. There were 2 I didn't buy back in. These were expensive then, and they're just ridiculous now. I did not pick up Mercury Atlas. This is Mercury Redstone, and I did not pick up Saturn 1B. I regret that. I've regretted it for a very long time. But like I said, it took me 6 months to pay these off as it was. So you get what you get. And this is neat because it is 1/72 scale, and I think they did a really good job. It's got the single stage liquid fuel booster itself, the Redstone. And it has the Mercury capsule, and it has the launch abort, the escape system, the tower. And I'll tell you a funny story about the escape tower from when I was a kid. Because if there's anything that's been a lifelong passion of mine, and I do mean lifelong, literally, I remember my 3rd birthday getting space toys. I don't know what it is about space history and the men that did it and the women. It's always just touched me, and it's been a comfort thing for me, which explains why I like Star Trek and Star Wars and all that. But as a kid, I remember liking Star Trek and Star Wars, but I was just fascinated with space. So we're just going to talk about Project Mercury, and I'm just going to share little anecdotes. Now I'm going to be honest, I'm a historian. I am not an engineer. I'm not a rocket scientist. So while I know a little bit about the hardware, I'm mostly interested in the story, and if anything, I'm interested in space capsules, or as the astronauts preferred back then, spaceships. So you'll probably hear me talking more about that. But let's talk about the Mercury Redstone booster launch vehicle. From tip to tip, disregard the steel rod that just keeps it in the pedestal, to the end of the escape tower, it's a little over 83 foot. And not counting the fins, it's just under 6 foot wide. And it's about 66,000 pounds. And it could launch a maximum payload of about 4,000 pounds into a suborbital trajectory, basically parabolic arc going ballistic. It was just, it was one engine, liquid fueled. It used a combination of ethyl alcohol, water, and liquid oxygen as the oxidizer for propellant. And they went with this not because it was the strongest and most reactive, but because it was the safest at the time. And this is actually a direct descendant of the V2. Yeah, that V2 from Nazi Germany, World War II. I do actually have a model of a V2, but it's not out here, so I'm sorry. But yeah, it does look shockingly similar to this. And of course, the U.S. copied the V2. They got V2s. They got the rocket engineers, von Braun. If you look, I think Doctor Strangelove is a documentary. I love that film. Anyway, what this ended up being the original Redstone, the PGM-11. It was first tested in 1953, and by 1958, it was in service with the U.S. Army Ballistic Missile Service, and it was a surface-to-surface missile. So that's why the Army had it. And it was actually the oldest active ballistic missile in inventory, and that's why they went with it for Project Mercury. Well, they went with it eventually. The base it comes with is very respectable, very heavy wood. It's got a little placard. Even has probably dusty because they've been moving it. Felt on it. Before NASA was a thing, back around 56, the Eisenhower administration said that they wanted a civilian rocket for the American space program. It was politically more neutral and everything, and this would result in Vanguard. And there were plans to launch Vanguard and the first satellite before the end of 1957. Now, as you know and I know, in October of that year, Sputnik went up, and because Russia played its space program very coy and would not announce things until they were actually successful, I'm sure some in U.S. intelligence knew it was coming, but it was a shock to even the government, not to mention the population, and really kicked off the space race. And the U.S. could have caught up quite quickly because that December they would launch Vanguard, or they'd try to, and it would crash and burn, taking the satellite with it. That forced them to kind of go to the backup, the Redstone rocket here. Well, a derivative of it, you would have what was known as the Jupiter C, which was used for a couple of suborbital tests. And then you would have Juno, and that version in this rocket family would be used to send Explorer 1 up January 31st, 1958. So we're behind them, but only 3-4 months at this point. Also, this year is when NASA was created as a civilian organization, although it's going to be dominated by military personnel, test pilots, and, of course, German engineers, including Dr. Strangelove. And they would use the Redstone here. In fact, NASA would order 8 of these, and it was a big deal to make them man-rated. They actually would have to make over 800 changes, with the launch abort system being just one of them. And they would actually have to redesign the whole structure of the body. And this is why the first test flight of Mercury Redstone would not occur until the end of 1960. I said this is a single-stage rocket, and that's true, but there is a line here. There are actually 2 sections, and they were permanently bolted together for this version, and it was already stretched out from the Jupiter Juno version for extra fuel tankage. So they were bolted together. This was known as the aft section, and this back here was the tail section. The tail would house the single engine, fuel tanks, and these fins weren't just static. Well, the engine didn't gimbal. The fins could direct flight somewhat. And then the aft section up here would actually be more the electronics, gyros, interfacing with the capsule, that kind of bulkhead area, all that. Fun fact, they actually toyed with the idea of making these recoverable using a parachute. But while the plans were there and probably would have worked, kind of a la SpaceX, it never came to fruition. And of course, it would be capped off by the Mercury spacecraft itself. These were not made by the same company. The capsule was made by McDonnell, and the launch vehicle itself was made by Chrysler, who would supply these to the U.S. Army. The missile version will be in service through 1964, for what it's worth. And eventually, the system would get its time to shine, and it wouldn't go well. November 21st, 1960, Mercury Redstone 1, MR1, launched, and it went about as high as this. This is really a toy, but these are neat, kind of. They sell them in a little set under a few different brands, including the Action Products series, which I'm a big fan of. They're just little kind of scale models to themselves. Probably about about 1/200, I'd say. Hey, look, you can get the whole set of these for less than what one of the little dragons costs. So hey, anyway, that did not go well. That flight was the 4-inch flight. It just went and then. So less than a month later, December, there was MR1A. Yeah, that was a successful suborbital test flight, which would lead to MR2, January 31st, so actually the anniversary of Explorer, which put Ham, the chimpanzee, not the meat. Well, he's made of meat because he's a chimp, but luckily he was living meat and lived a long life afterwards, into a little suborbital flight. And just under 2 months later in March, well, we had MR1, MR2, so naturally we would have MRBD. Okay, this was a final booster development flight before it would be officially man-rated, and it was obviously a success because May 5, we would have Al Shepard's famous flight on MR3. But in the interim, April 12, the Soviets would successfully launch Vostok 1 with Yuri Gagarin. And not only would he go into space, he would actually achieve orbit and be in space just over 90 minutes, making one orbit. So getting Sputnik up was a lead, but now with Gagarin not even doing a suborbital but a full orbital flight, well, NASA has got something to prove, and it has its critics. Not like the critics today that thinks that NASA's hiding space whales or something, but actual critics. But before we go there, I'm going to put this up in case one of the cats decides to come and be loud. It's pretty heavy and stable, but did I mention these were really expensive, especially to replace? Let's go back a couple of years and talk about the men and the suit they wore. Got a few little Mercury astronaut figures. Here's a little one. He's about a 150 scale, 155. And here's one that's kind of a G.I. Joe action figure version with articulation. Not much, but hey, he actually has more than the original Star Wars. And here's more of a 6-inch scale statue. And of course, they're all wearing the same suit, which was really derived from a flight suit at the time we'll get to. He's happy to see you. So, I'm sure you know, astronaut training and all that was very rigorous back then, but they were, working out of nowhere. And in 1958, they started picking who to go from. And they were a lot of rules and things, but some of them were you had to be between 25 and 40 years of age. You had to be 5'11" or less. So, sorry if you're 6 foot, because you wouldn't fit in the capsule properly. You had to be a college graduate, something made famous by the fact that Chuck Yeager was ruled out. You basically had to be active military, all that. And beyond that, you had to have just hours and hours of flight experience, and you had to just meet demanding physical requirements. And basically be of good character, because these are going to be promoted as national heroes. Ironically, even though Russia went to space first, they did not actually start picking their cosmonauts until around 1960. And while they had very strict requirements too, and their people were very qualified, individually they were younger and they had less experience. Anyway, they would shortlist around 508 potential candidates, most of them test pilots and whatnot, and they would examine their records. And of those, 110 would be invited for face-to-face interviews and initial testing. And from that, 32 would be on the down select, the short list. And then these would be whittled down to what was supposed to be 6 in 1959. But in the end, they got down to 7, and they could not slice one more off. Thus, April 9, 1959, the world was introduced to the Mercury 7. Shepard, Grissom, Glenn, Cooper, Carter, Shira, which I'm going to say Shira at some point in this video because that's how my sheet says it, and it's goofing me up. And Slayton. And if you were wondering, 3 were from the new U.S. Air Force, which means they were former Army. 3 were Navy, and 1 was a Marine. You can guess who is who. We'll get into them a little bit more as we get into the individual flights. Now, out of the 7, we would only have 6 flights. But we'll get there. So they would undergo training in every way possible. G-force training was a big deal. Stress testing, swimming was a big deal. Survival training in the desert. And just trying to anticipate whatever. And they were held up as national heroes. Life magazine would do stories on them. Very, very opposite to what Russia was doing with their cosmonauts. They really were. And they were a different breed. Most of them were combat veterans serving in Korea and or World War II. And they were, hard-drinking, hard-playing men. Not quite the paragons we would think of today, not scientists, not to say they weren't intelligent. Again, they were all college-educated. But it was a different time. This was the frontier era, the Wild West of things. So they got away with some stuff probably later generations of astronauts absolutely could not. On the other hand, it's kind of what made it charming. It was definitely more of a test pilot deal. And that's another thing to absolutely keep in mind is Russia would put men into space, but they were passengers. Now, Gagarin did have a way to access the controls if need be, but they're actually locked out by a secret code which he did have, but yeah. Whereas the Mercury capsule was automated. Obviously, Ham was there. But it could be flown, and it actually had a flight stick and other things. And as the missions would go on, we'll see more and more interaction and stuff. So in a lot of ways, it was more long-term beneficial. So before we talk about the capsule, let's talk about the suit itself for just a minute. There's not a whole lot here. This is the Navy Mark IV high-altitude suit. Well, a derivative of. Honestly, investigating which suit to use was one of NASA's earliest priorities in 1958, for good reason. And very quickly, the two options would either be the suit used in the X-15, which, don't worry, we'll cover that aircraft one day. In fact, there was a time when they were considering using that for the earliest manned space flights, but the capsule Mercury obviously is what we went with. Anyway, they looked at it, and they looked at the Navy's new Mark IV suit, which was just coming online about that time, and was used in aircraft like the F-8 Crusader, actually one of my favorites, and later the A-5 Vigilante, and even the F-4 Phantom, and actually it would serve in the Navy up into the early 70s. The new NASA astronaut program, which actually originally was named Project Astronaut before it was renamed to Project Mercury, would pick this because it was the lightest suit available at 22 pounds. Previous ones are much heavier. This still allowed mobility and flexibility in flight. It used elastic and nylon and pressure seals and everything so that they could move around performing tasks and what have you. Whereas the X-15 was felt to be too bulky, too heavy, because every pound matters on a space mission. So they started work there. These are made by B.F. Goodrich Company. They made the Navy versions, and they made the Project Mercury version. And each astronaut of the Mercury 7 would have 3 suits custom made for them. One for the actual flight, one as a backup, and one to be used throughout the months, years of training for, again, very obvious reasons. So what mods did they make from the original Navy? Looking at our smallest feller here, you'll notice he's carrying a box. That's actually an air conditioner box. It connects to a port in the midsection, and that's because unlike the Navy version, it has a circulation system where air comes in here and then goes out through the helmet. So life support is provided externally. It doesn't really have any internal support. So the capsule itself would provide oxygen and pressure and all that. And it was a full pressure suit. And the faceplate could close, but most of the time it was left open, and it was only there if the capsule lost pressure. And there were a couple of different ways it could be actuated. Compressed air cylinder was used early on. Later on, there was a mechanical version, and you can understand why the astronauts would want it open. Another area were the gloves. They made them much more dexterous, especially like the pointing fingers and stuff, so that they could operate controls. Otherwise, they'd have to use Homer's dialing wand from The Simpsons. If you remember that episode, let me know. They also would give them different boots. There actually were leather boots, but they were coated. In fact, the whole suit, the original Navy version, was kind of a gray material. It was given the silver coloring to help with the temperature regulation control. Something it was never really great at. One thing the astronauts did complain about was temperature. I mean, they did what they could, but you can understand why they might get uncomfortable. And there were several other things done. There was a mirror added to the chest to reflect the control panel back for the camera. A small life preserver would be incorporated. Obviously, bio monitors. There's a hookup here. And just various other little things to add mobility and durability for up to a day's flight. And it would only be used for Project Mercury, so flights from 1961 to 63. Afterwards, they would move on to a new model of spacesuit. I've always thought suits really neat. But this really does blend the whole aviator astronaut suit thing quite a bit. I do think it's funny that they had leather boots and stuff. I mean, a lot of it was still off the shelf hardware. There wasn't a lot of custom stuff made at this time if they could help it. But obviously the spacecraft itself, well, you gotta custom make it. So let's talk about the Mercury capsule manufactured by McDonnell. These aren't exactly to scale, but relatively close. Use about 118. This capsule is about 124. And it's pretty neat to represent what was manufactured by McDonnell. NASA would actually order 20 of these and would ultimately use 15 with over a dozen launches. Most successful, but not all. Luckily, of course, no loss of life tests and all that. What we have here is essentially a topper to the Redstone and later Atlas rockets. It replaced the warhead on top and really is functionally a tin can. It measures just shy of 9 feet long, and at its widest point is about 6 feet. Again, not quite scale, but gives you an idea. But that's external. And the skin was a nickel alloy designed for high temperature and has this really cool texture to it that we don't see on later generations of spacecraft. But it was early days. And there will be attachments to the front and the rear we'll look at in a minute. But this is just the basic craft as it re-entered with the ablative heat shield back here. NASA did several studies and it was determined that a bell or cone shape with the blunt end would come in, because obviously what goes up must come down. All that energy spent getting up there has to be burned off, and so different ways of getting the heat were tried out, but a heat shield ultimately was the way to go in one of the most nerve-wracking parts of space travel. It is a very basic machine, but also very complicated in precision for its day and time. It weighed 3,000 pounds. As I mentioned earlier, the Redstone could do up to 4,000 in a suborbital, so there was room to spare for the crew. Obviously, the first two missions would be much shorter, but from the get-go, this was designed to support one single occupant for roughly 1 day. And what do we have inside? And what makes this neat is it does have a removable hatch here. Sorry for the blue tack. It's not hinged because the real one wasn't. The actual hatch was about 30 inches by 24, so just enough to get a person in there. And it was bolted on, as I'm sure you are familiar with. The earliest ones were just bolted on. Later we had explosive bolts. But either way, it wasn't something that could be opened and closed because there was no thought of, getting out of the craft. And then inside, we have the couch there. The astronaut was in a semi-reclined position with his legs arched up for comfort and circulation. And he had a flight stick. In fact, there were 120 controls inside, all, analog. Basically, there was no computer on board. Computers of the day and time would not fit anyway. It was powered by batteries. They would not have had enough juice for that. No, any computing came from the ground. So, especially after the first couple of flights, manual input would actually go from optional to quite necessary. And if you're aware of space travel, you know that the first Vostok mission, Gagarin ejected. That was never the plan here. It would have parachute and go for a water landing versus a ground landing. That's what's in there. It's really neat. It's got quite a nice interior. Surfaces. So inside, once you kind of account for everything, we have about 60 cubic feet of space. It's 6 foot front to back. Remember how I said everyone had to be under 6 foot? Well, part of us, so they just fit in there. And then it was about 2.5 foot in either direction as far as, movable space. I mean, you weren't going to get out of your seat. You're in there. You were strapped in. And obviously by the dimensions, it's not much. I mean, it would fit in quite a few rooms just sitting there. And they would modify these, adding features, removing features. I already mentioned the hatch would change. Rather famously, the first version did not have a window. Then they would add a window to the hatch. And there would be some other minor changes. But all in all, it was the design that they selected and that they would stick with throughout Mercury before the whole program was retired. Of course, even Ham was in a version of the Mercury capsule. And as I said, this is just the base unit right here. It also has a neat little wood stand that I like. The stand is wood. This is a type of resin, although it's got a lot of weight to it. And again, you got your hatch here. Luckily, when I bought this, I did pick up the other two they offered, Gemini and Apollo. I only wish they had Vostok and Soyuz. Here we have another one. This is again from the Action Products toy line. Years ago, you could pick these up in gift shops at NASA and Houston, Cape Canaveral, all that stuff. But I brought it out because it does have the attachments. Up here, this module has thrusters for maneuvering. They had 3 axes of control. And that's something to point out, that Mercury, while it was lagging behind Vostok, it was able to do orbital maneuvers and change its orbital plane in ways that Vostok just wasn't. And this module up here is primarily responsible for that. Back here we have the retro rocket pack they would strap on. That would obviously come down. It was held on in front of the heat shield with metal straps, and obviously just slow descent into the atmosphere a bit to give it a fighting chance. See the indent there. This is close in size, but a little bit smaller. Larger than 148 though, so if we were going to say it's to scale, probably around 136. Because later we'll look at one closer to 148. This is fine. It's just a kind of a rubber material, but these are just neat little gift shop ornaments, and I don't know, they're fun. But it does come with something that's a good talking point. And that's actually why I wanted it, because it has the abort system, the escape tower here. And that just clips on, I guess. And I said at the beginning of the video I would tell a funny story. When I was a little kid, I knew what this was. I knew it was the escape tower. And I also knew something else. We talked about the hatch for the capsule, which is on the side to the right hand of the pilot. But there's also a secondary hatch up here. It's kind of an emergency egress. It has to be unbolted from the inside, and it's just big enough for him to come out. You know, if it made a water landing and something happened to the main hatch, he could come out the top. So I knew that that was a secondary emergency hatch. You see where I'm going? I thought as a kid, little kid, that in the event of an emergency, the astronaut would get up. This is during launch, mind you. I knew it happened during launch. That he would get up, come through the hatch on the top, climb up this scaffolding like a ladder, and get in this little rocket up here and fly off. I thought it was a tiny little escape craft. When in actuality, of course, it would pull the Mercury capsule off the booster vehicle, and it could be either activated from inside the capsule by the astronaut or from the ground. And of course there is sensing equipment within the rocket to let them know if something was, if it was about to go kaboom. And I'm bringing that up because we're still not quite ready to talk about the actual manned missions. Let's talk about Joe. Little and big. Little Joe was a series of pretty much short flights to test the launch abort system using a solid fuel single stage rocket, so not Redstone and definitely not Atlas. The first would happen in August of 1959 using basically a faux capsule in this abort system, and it was a failure. They would retry again in November, and it was nominally a success, and they would try again in December of 1959, and luckily it was a success because it was a biological test. There was a rhesus monkey on board named Sam, and luckily he lived. There was a fourth flight the following January, 1960, for further qualifications, and then it would succeed, and there wouldn't be a Little Joe until November of that year. In LJ5, well, it was a max Q test. Basically, they tried separating the capsule from the booster at the highest G load point, highest atmosphere at highest velocity, just the absolute highest stress possible, and LJ5 would fail that November. They would attempt the max Q test again, March, and this was considered a partial failure, partial success, glass half empty, half full. The capsule did separate, but extreme stresses and shear, something that would have been very uncomfortable for the pilot and hardware. So progress, but not quite there yet. And they would give it another go that April, and finally they pull it off. The capsule separates from the booster, everything's the way it needs to be normally, and the pilot, if there had been anyone on board, would have survived. So they can finally fully man-rate this on that effect, as far as the launch abort system. However, what about re-entry? What about that heat shield? This is all new technology. Is it even going to work? For that, we need Big Joe. Going back September 9, 1959, they have a boilerplate capsule on top of an Atlas D missile, which is the original military variant of what would be the Mercury Atlas launch vehicle coming up later, we'll talk about. But it would test the heat shield, basically get it up to high enough altitude that it would drop and have enough heat and stress. And also they could test the parachutes and everything. Basically a suborbital flight. It was never meant to go all the way up, but high enough, basically simulating Al Shepard's first thing. We'll talk about it. But the Atlas was having issues, failure rates and everything. Well, good news, it did succeed. They were able to test the heat shield and parachutes. However, the Atlas had 3 engines. One of them failed, meaning that it didn't go as high as they'd hoped. But luckily, because they didn't have all that many launch vehicles, they got high enough that they were able to do the tests they want to do, and also go, hey, we need to keep working on Atlas, which is something, that would not get fixed right away. But luckily, for the first missions, Mercury Redstone, they didn't need Atlas. Now we can bring this back out where we started the video. And it was announced in January of 1961 that Alan Shepard, a Navy man, would be America's first astronaut, with John Glenn, the Marine, as kind of the backup, the second runner candidate. I guess the Air Force was just out right then. Actually, the original booster and capsule would arrive at Cape Canaveral, which had been picked in Florida, really from nothing, because of its location to the equator. Of course, mission control would be established in Houston. Anyway, the booster and capsule, originally planned, would arrive in December of 1960, but the booster would be swapped out. And so its replacement would not arrive until March of 1961. The capsule, for what it's worth, was the 7th one that McDonnell produced. Thus, Shepard named it Freedom 7. Although the naming convention would continue afterwards. So they were mated together, and the original launch was scheduled for May 2nd, but it had to be scrubbed because of poor weather. So America's problem at the Cape is weather. Russia's problem at Kazakhstan, in that area on the steppe, is because it's further away from the equator. So, nothing's perfect, I suppose. Anyway, on May 5, Al Shepard would get up at 1 a.m., prepare medical for his flight, and would enter the capsule at 5:15 or so, with a planned launch of 7:20. And each of the Mercury 7 astronauts would perform a role communicating, observing, taking care of their friend. But around 7 a.m., the planned flight had to be postponed. Weather, there was some cloud cover they wanted to clear. There was a power generator that was acting up, and a computer in mission control needed to be rebooted. I'm not sure if they actually meant a computer or one of the ladies that computed, but either way, someone got rebooted. And then in my notes, 8 a.m., my notes just say, gotta go, gotta go, gotta go. If you know, you know. Finally, the go-ahead would be given, and they would hit countdown at 9:45 a.m., and by 9:49, it was off the pad and heading, well, into history, corny as that might sound. The redstone would burn for about 2.5 minutes, ultimately putting Al Shepard about 116 miles high. He would actually experience nearly 12 Gs, especially upon return. Of course, once up, the capsule would separate from the booster, and the booster would just burn up on re-entry. And of course, the launch escape system, no longer useful, would also eject and easily burn up, leaving us with this. And so Shepard would test each of the maneuvering jets on each axis, make a few basic observations, but it wouldn't be long before it was time for the retro rockets to fire, because his total flight was just under 15.5 minutes. Yeah, it was just, up and down. Good news is he didn't have to wait in the ocean long. He was about 300 miles from where he started, and he was only in the water like 11 minutes. And then he stayed in the capsule. A helicopter came by, picked him up, planted him on the deck of the USS Champlain. And there you go. America's first man in space. After all the delays, basically not long after 10 a.m., he was back on the ground and getting ticker tape parades and call from the president. And I'm not making light of it. It was still a huge risk. Many things could have gone wrong. Luckily, the worst thing he suffered was some wet undies. What to do next? Well, let's do it again. And there's a bit of a deadline because the Russians are planning Vostok 2 for August of 1961. So America plans MR4 for July. Originally, July 16, then 18, then 19, scrubbed for weather and other reasons. Finally, July 21, Virgil, Yvonne, Gus Grissom gets on board his capsule, Liberty 7. At this point, the 7 is meaning the 7 Mercury astronauts, and he chose Liberty Bell. Liberty Bell is his name. Here's the little one. This is 172 scale from Dragon. And his was the first to have the explosive hatch bolts for quick release. It was tied to a lanyard and whatnot. And I believe his was the first to have the small viewing window on the right-hand side and set into the hatch. I might be wrong. It might be the next mission. But I believe Grissom's did. For sure. The little window they would put in was not huge. About 10 inches by 8, give or take. But better than nothing. If you're wondering if Shepard could see outside, he could. There were a couple of small porthole things, and there was a telescope, a periscope he could use as well, but nothing really special. So it would go up. He had a small delay, but he launched right after noon, so he still had a couple hours to cool his heels for a 15-minute suborbital flight. He would splash down, and as is famously known, the hatch would blow. Should mention that Gus was an Air Force man, not a Navy man, so he just wasn't at home in the water. No, I was always a believer that Gus did nothing wrong. And finally, that was proven in 1999 because Liberty Bell 7 sank. The astronaut was saved, of course, but it filled with water and went down. So they couldn't really prove his innocence, sadly, until long after he was gone. But when they recovered the capsule, they could prove that it hadn't been activated. Turns out the lanyard that held the cord on the outside, because the hatch could be blown from inside by punching a really hard lever, or it could be activated outside by pulling a ripcord, basically. And they could prove it when they finally recover the capsule. It was actually in really good shape. It had been preserved very well. He was able to make better observations from Earth. Shepard tried the controls. Grissom did some basic observations, but in a 15-minute flight, you don't exactly have a lot of time on your hands. And NASA obviously liked him because he was a key part of the later Gemini program, and would have been a key part of Apollo, but very tragic. But he was the astronaut that was part of all three programs, and he's kind of always been a favorite of mine. I don't know. I just, he worked hard. He seemed like he was a really hard worker in it. And he seemed like he was really an astronaut's astronaut. This is kind of cool from Dragon. It's just a little one, but it's weighted. It's got a little metal thing. So I thought I'd bring it out to celebrate Liberty Bell. And that was the final launch of the Mercury Redstone. It had proven itself, and now it's time to go big or go home and hopefully not murder an astronaut in the process, because now we have to talk about the Atlas. I tried very hard to find a 172 scale or even a 100 scale Mercury Atlas. I really do wish I had picked one up back in the day. But all I've got is this small one here from that set, same as the Redstone here. If you notice, it's not much taller, but it's a lot more massive. This thing, like I said, it's about 66,000 pounds. This is over 250,000 pounds. And this is considered a 1.5 stage booster. And the Mercury Atlas used the Atlas LV-3B, which was the man-rated version of the Atlas D, which was the first operational ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. So it actually already was going into suborbital flight, doing its thing. It just had to be changed. And just like with Redstone, a lot of it had to do with safety systems, adding better gyros and redundancies. So what's the big deal? In 1959, the Atlas D had 5 failures in a row, not exactly inspiring confidence with the astronauts. I mentioned that Big Joe, which used the Atlas, had 1 out of 3 engines fail, and so it was only a partial success. To be fair, 2-stage missiles were available, but NASA liked the Atlas because it had all 3 going at once. And so they could see they were going at launch, and it gave them more threshold at the time. Now, this used kerosene and liquid oxygen LOX, so more powerful but less person-friendly. And it was going to take some doing. Now, how it was supposed to work in theory, and while I don't have a really good scale version of this, I do have this. The SpaceX Falcon Heavy, which I did a 3-part series on SpaceX, if you're interested. Boy, I would give my eye teeth for the same Chinese company to do die-cast versions of the U.S. and Russian spacecraft in this style. Yeah, because the price was good. These are great. Anyway, it's about a 1/200 scale. I just thought I'd bring it out to kind of give the eye. So just pretend like each of these is just one engine. Center is your main sustainer engine. Outer ones are your boosters. You take off All are burning. At about 60,000 feet or so, after a little over 2 minutes, your external boosters drop away. There you go. Leaving the sustainer going. It's going to burn for a total of about 5 minutes, putting you into a stable, dependable orbit. And that's what they needed. They needed something that could do that. The Redstone, no way, no how could. The only other thing that was possible was the Titan, but it was still in development, and NASA absolutely did not have time to wait on it. They're still very much playing catch up with the Russians. Titan would obviously come later with the Gemini program. So yeah. Okay, here. Anywho, so we had Little Joe and Big Joe we talked about. And the first attempt of a Mercury Atlas, MA1, would be July 29, 1960. And it didn't go to plan. MA1 was a failure. It didn't do what it was needed doing. They would actually figure out that the rocket, the booster itself, with the weight on top, was just getting stressed too much at high Gs and was causing things to break apart. So they had to redesign it. MA2 would come February of 1961 and would be redesigned a bit, and also would be a suborbital shot, so a little more conservative, and it would succeed. 2 months later, we would have MA3, and it would fail because of a guidance system glitch or error. But hey, look on the bright side, they get to test the abort launch system and recovery, and they actually did recovery the boilerplate capsule. So, hey. MA4 would be the next orbital attempt, and it would be on September 13. And yes, I checked. It wasn't a Friday, it was a Wednesday, which is why maybe it worked. This would be the first time that an Atlas launch vehicle would successfully put a Mercury capsule into a stable orbit. MA5 would come on November 29, and it was another quote-unquote biological test. They stuffed another primate. This is another chimpanzee called Enos, the Hands of Fate. Okay, I know it's Manos, but I couldn't help make the joke. And thankfully, because I'm a softie for animals, Enos survived. He made 2 orbits, so he was in space a little over 3 hours. The flight wasn't perfect, but he was fine. And this would clear the way for MA6 on February 20, 1962. And this is where we're trying to catch up to the Russians. Of course, I'm talking about John Glenn's flight on Friendship 7. This figure here is specifically meant to be John Glenn, and it's from a set from Hot Wheels from back in the 90s, which also came with this capsule here, which is really cool. This is actually die cast. It's about 150, 155 scale. If you put it up to like one of the Chinese craft over there, you see just how small these really were. But I like it. It's got the maneuvering thrusters. It has the retro strapped on there. It's got a little cutout window so you can see him in there. Of course, that wouldn't be there on the ship. Like I said, the window he had was actually not even a foot by a foot. So there you go. But I really like it. It's a neat little set. Not the biggest fan of Hot Wheels most of the time. Anyway, so his flight was actually supposed to happen on January 16, but there was over a month worth of delays. And I still want to emphasize the Atlas missile had not shaken its early issues. I mean, it was better, But yeah, and even MA5 with Enos there. Look, it wasn't perfect. They had thruster issues. There was temperature, climate control. Keep in mind, to this point, Mercury capsule had been in space for not even 15 minutes because the whole flights were just over 15 minutes. They're planning not just one orbit, like Vostok 1, but 6, 7, 8 orbits. See how it goes. So they're really stress testing duration of the capsule. Enos only did 2 orbits, and they had to bring him home. And the worst part about MA5, the poor creature was being shocked, literally, for part of the flight. It's a whole thing. You can read up on it. Again, I'm really soft when it comes to animals. Sue me. So yeah, John Glenn, yeah, he was pretty damn brave. And this capsule here, it definitely had the window by this point, and it had the new explosive hatch thing, and it had a small emergency gate kit, because again, they didn't know how long it was going to be up there. Even if he wasn't up there long, when he landed, who knows if they would get to him as quick as they had like Al Shepard. And there was even some food on board. Because he was a Marine, it was actually a pack of crayons. I heard that green was his favorite. After many delays, he gets in the capsule shortly after 11 a.m. And for once, there are no delays for launch, and so shortly after 1 p.m. on the 20th, it goes up, and the flight goes without a hitch. The Atlas LV-3B launch vehicle works fine, and the Mercury capsule spacecraft works fine, at least for orbit 1. The first 90 minutes, roughly an orbit is just over 90 minutes, goes well. But there are glitches, there are issues. One of the most persistent and annoying was climate control. I was mentioning much earlier about the suits and astronauts complaining about them just being too warm. Well, Glenn really suffered that, and he found, or I should really say, he was too warm. Anyway, basically, if he cooled his suit off, it would make the cabin too humid. So he would stop doing that, and then he would get hot. The humidity would go away. So it was a balancing act. Humidity versus comfort. It wasn't terribly nice. Also, he started having some minor thruster acting up issues, so he took manual control. Nothing to be there. And he did perform some scientific little experiments, and he did bring a 35mm camera on board the first time to do that, taking photos. Interestingly, some at NASA didn't really like this. This was very much an initiative thing. Like I said earlier, this was the test pilot, the Wild West, the cowboy days a bit, where astronauts could just do that. Wouldn't happen forever. Notice the little, how the rockets face there, maneuvering. I really do like this little one. Wish they did more in this series. Anyway, it was towards the end of the second, beginning in the third orbit, that the whole heat shield thing became a concern. Down at NASA, one of the sensors was claiming the heat shield was disconnected, was loose. But the capsule, its sensors were saying it was fine. So who's right, who's wrong? This is a rather important system. You don't want your single means of not dying when you re-enter going away, flying off. And this is when they decided, instead of ejecting the retro pack before hitting the atmosphere, they're just going to leave it on because these steel straps might keep it in place at least long enough for the friction to press it up, and what could it hurt? I find that a little odd. I mean, there's not much they could do about it. I understand the life of the man, but I don't understand why ending the mission prematurely was considered good. I mean, I figure at that point you're already up there, 3 orbits or 6 or 7 or 8. what's it matter? But then again, maybe the heat issue. They'd proven the point. And at this point, the mission had already gone on for over 4.5 hours. It would ultimately come down to just under 5 hours. Well, luckily for everyone, it was just a sensor glitch down at NASA. Reentry was fine. Having the retro pack attached for reentry didn't hurt anything. Just, burned up and all that. And luckily, when he hit the ocean, he did not have a hatch issue like Grissom. That's what happens when you put a chair force guy in water. He freaks out. No, really. I definitely don't. Grissom did anything wrong. But if I made a joke about a Marine, no jokes can be made about Navy, though. It was a historic flight, and this is where we at least caught up to Gagarin. But of course, by this point, the Russians have made their own first. They've done multiple orbit flights, multiple things. But at least we did it, and we proved Atlas, and we proved the concept, and we proved that the capsule could last several hours, and now we can quit launching chimps into orbit. Unfortunately, we have no more Marines, so we'll have to just fall back on Navy and Air Force guys. This is a point where a lot of documentaries and things about the Mercury program kind of stop. They get through Glenn, and then they give very little to the next 3 missions, the second half of the whole Mercury program. But I think this is when things get really interesting, because the first 3 flights were just proof of concept. They really were just test pilot flights. But now we can actually do things, be it from a piloting standpoint or a scientific standpoint. MA7 was planned to be a repeat of MA6, so roughly a 5-hour flight, with some focus on science and Earth observation. And it was planned to be flown by Deke Slayton in Delta 7. However, March of 1962, it was discovered he had an irregular heartbeat, a heart condition. So he was actually taken off the flight roster, but he would remain with NASA and wait over a dozen years before he could finally go into space on Apollo Soyuz in 1975. But he was a key part of the astronaut program, selection, scheduling, real team player. Credit where credit's due. And obviously Delta 7 would never fly. That was his capsule. So the next mission, May 24, would be assigned to Scott Carpenter. And other parameters would be exactly, he was meant to do some fluid dynamic testing, take some photos, try to do some observations from Earth. And, if Gus Grissom didn't do well in the water because he was an Air Force guy, Carpenter maybe had an issue or two up high because he was a Navy guy. Scott Carpenter entered his craft around 4:45 a.m. By the way, his was named Aurora 7. And would blast off on time at 7:45 a.m., give or take. So about 3 hours, normal. Plan for 3 orbits, as I mentioned. It should be noted that John Glenn had been given basically food tubes, food paste, in addition to his crayons. Well, Carpenter would actually be given food cubes to try out. And this is where we learn just how bad crumbs are in space. So that didn't go well. He did address some other things, tried some stuff. He tried to observe a flare launch from the ground, couldn't spot it. He really used his maneuvering thrust quite a bit, burning through fuel at a much higher rate than had been planned. And NASA thought he was either slow to respond to orders, requests from the ground, or just kind of ignored them, doing his own thing. It seemed like they felt he went a little rogue. It's hard to argue that he was at least somewhat distracted because he actually fired his retro rockets a full 18 seconds after they were supposed to be, meaning that he did not come down when and where he was supposed to, and meaning that for an hour, give or take, the press was speculating, because just like today, back then, speculation, that maybe NASA had lost an astronaut. Maybe he'd burned up upon re-entry, something else had gone wrong. So that was bad press, and the higher-ups and the politicians, and yeah, no one likes that. I mean, they're just on their fourth flight. Yeah, basically, Carpenter becomes effectively blacklisted within NASA, and he will really be the first to retire from the agency, going his own way by 1964. So this would be his only flight. But it was 5 hours, and I don't want to be hard on the guy. I think it'd be very easy to get enamored with space, and I'm sure some things that weren't his fault were put on him. But the science wasn't really a success. The food testing was. It wasn't the textbook mission they were hoping for. But the next one, they were damn sure was gonna be MA8. This mission would be a different profile from the previous two. It would be Wally Schirra in Sigma 7. It actually planned to launch in September of 1962, but through various delays, it would actually go October 3rd. He would again enter the capsule a little before 5 a.m., have a little bit of a delay, but still be on his way not long after 8 a.m. And they were planning for a 9-hour flight. And they weren't really thinking about science and all that. They were thinking about human endurance, testing pilot skills, kind of working out just tactics and all that for space travel. And it worked brilliantly. He did everything. I mean, it's hard to really say. He completed his 6 orbits. He did everything by the book, took orders. He figured out a few little quirks. He did complain about his suit heat issue, like Glenn had done before. It's just kind of how it goes. Of course, these guys are benefiting from the astronaut diaper. I mean, you got to do something. Going to be up that long. We are starting to push it, and it is such a textbook mission that some in NASA, some in leadership think maybe it's time to close out Project Mercury. They feel like they've almost completely caught up to the Russians. There's still one or two areas they haven't quite, but everyone else, they've done multiple orbits, they've done this and that. Maybe it's just time to end the program. But in the end, they do continue. MA9, flown by Gordo Cooper, Faith 7. He was Air Force, but I believe he started off in the Marines early on, but I could be wrong on that. Was meant to kind of tackle the Russians in the one area America was still behind. Just pure dogged endurance. And to be fair, the Mercury capsule was built for a day, so it could be done. And on top of that, they had made some further refinements to the Atlas booster. They'd actually been around for a while, but they were kind of nervous to use a new version for MA7 and even 8. But with MA9, yeah, they're going to use an updated version of the booster. The capsule itself is not all that changed, but the spacesuit is. For one thing, they get rid of the mirror on the chest and the life vest. again, they know he's going to be up for a while, so they do some things. They have booties. By that I mean, instead of having separate leather boots, now they're just integrated into the suit. They also change the shoulders a bit for better movement and comfort. They do what they can to address the overheating issue. The helmet gets new headphones and speakers. I would say the biggest improvement, they went from a rectal thermometer to just an oral one. So yeah, not having something shoved up your butt for a day would that put me in a better mood. Originally, it was going to launch on May 14. In fact, Gordo gets in his capsule at about 6:30 that morning, but it had to be scrubbed. Luckily, they'd try again the next day, and on May 15, about 8 a.m., he'd get in there and launch successfully. It'd go great. The new booster would work well, and pretty soon into it, after the first orbit, just settling in, he starts tasks. He takes photos, begins a few small science things. A few orbits in, he actually has a meal. Well, we tried the paste in a tube. Then we tried cubes. He's trying powdered roast beef with a side of water, which, well, sounds better than cubes. And then orbit 9 is meant to be a rest period. But gosh darn it, he just can't sleep. So he spends his night, as it were, taking photos and just doing observations. So at this point, we're over half a day into a flight. We've just busted right past previous American records, and we're seriously challenging what the Soviets have been able to achieve by this point in 1963. Orbit 17 saw the first video broadcast from space. Cooper did. The quality was crap, but hey, it happened. And things would go well through 18. It was orbit 19 when there started to be glitches and malfunctions. You're starting to see the Mercury capsule being pushed to its limit. And Gordon is able to take control of some, work around others. Most of these would continue through orbit 20, meaning that at the end of this, the ground decided, you know what, let's bring them home. So they prepare for this on 21, and they're getting into the 22nd orbit when, well, he fires his retro rockets and makes a textbook splashdown. At which time, the U.S. has almost completely caught up to Russia. They have blown past the duration. We're at about 34 hours for Faith 7, MA9. The only area that Russia still clearly leads is just total flight hours, which, yeah, they've had several Vostoks. It just happens. And this comes to a debate, just like we'd seen at the end of MA8. Should Mercury continue, or should we end it? MA10 is ready to go. In fact, Al Shepard is scheduled to do it. He was Cooper's backup for MA9. And it would be a 3-day mission, which, wow. If the Mercury capsule was struggling after not even a day and a half, 3 days, doubling that, I mean, it'd be cool if they do. But in the end, MA10 is scrubbed. Probably for the best, going out on a high. And the new Gemini hardware is getting close. The Titan is almost ready. The new capsule, which actually Gus Grisham is working on, is well underway. McDonnell will be involved in it as well. Yeah, it just seems like time. NASA had purchased, I believe, 16 Atlas launch vehicles, and they'd used around 13 of them, and then a couple others were disposed to other programs. They still had a few capsules left, but, better to have more than you need. Yeah, at the end of 1963, it's time for Project Mercury to come to an end. But Gemini would be very close on its heels. And I'm going to be honest, it's probably my favorite of the programs. It's that middle child syndrome, but we'll talk about that next time. Just as an epilogue, the fate of our Mercury 7, Alan Shepard, would continue on in the program, ultimately being the only Mercury astronaut to walk on the moon. It was a little delayed, but eventually he was commander of Apollo 14. Gus Grissom, it is sad. He did fly on the first manned Gemini mission and would have probably flown on the first manned Apollo mission, but he and his crew lost their lives, unfortunately. In a fate some might consider worse than death, John Glenn would actually not fly into space again and would enter into politics, becoming a senator. And here he is, as Senator Glenn from that little Hot Wheels set. It is a tiny old man senator. Why not? I think it's hilarious. I know. He eventually would go into space again in 1998 at the age of 76, I believe, being the oldest person to ever go into space and being the only Mercury astronaut to fly on the space shuttle. Deke Slayton, as I mentioned, would be grounded for many, many years, from 1962, until 1975, when he would finally go into space. Talk about waiting for commitment. As part of the very important, at least politically speaking, Apollo-Soyuz mission, the handshake in space. One of the most underrated missions, and also the last flight of an Apollo capsule before switching over to the space shuttle. And of course, Scott Carpenter, we already talked about, that would be his only space flight. He was the one out of the bunch that ended kind of on a sour note. He said, she said, who's to say? But yeah, he would actually go into oceanography and get involved in those kinds of programs in the end. And then Wally Schirra would fly in Gemini, and he would command Apollo 7, the first manned flight of that. It was an orbital flight, and after that, he was kind of on the outs with NASA. There was a little bit of a mutiny in the crew, some this and that. It's a very interesting story, but at least he did get multiple space flights in, so that is what it is. As for Gordo, to be fair, he actually had the most time in space at the end of Mercury, so he was part of NASA. He was the backup commander for Gemini 4, the spacewalk, and did command Gemini 5, which gave him 8 days in space, still meaning he was one of the more experienced. And he would continue on into Apollo. In fact, he commanded the backup crew for Apollo 10, which was the dress rehearsal for the moon landing. And in theory, this actually might have had him in rotation for Apollo 13. That's tended to be how that worked. However, remember how I said this was the Wild West, the cowboy days? By 1969, 1970, the attitude at NASA is changing all around. It's becoming more professional, more technical, less time gallivanting and by the seat of your pants, more time in the simulator. And it was really felt that he didn't fit the culture. And interestingly, it was actually Deke Slayton that was one of the key guys that made this determination, which I'm sure wasn't easy on him, not putting his Mercury 7 buddy in the rotation, because he had a lot of sway there. Seeing the writing on the wall, Cooper would leave NASA, and the Air Force for that matter, at the end of 1970 and go about his own thing. So each of them had their own careers and their own ways, and most of them had a future in space flight, except for one and another that took decades to get there. But I really find it fascinating. I really do. And I enjoy picking up models, toys, displays of any of the space stuff. And I wish it were more popular with all the stuff out there. But when I do find it, it greatly delights me. And even though I know it's kind of a niche item, I enjoy sharing things that I enjoy. So I hope you enjoy it too. For what it's worth, while the Redstone was never really used for this again, versions of the Atlas were used to support unmanned vehicles, or at least they were in rotation for the Gemini program as well. And even then, the Redstone, its engine specifically, was used for the early Saturn 1 and Saturn 1B. It all goes for it. It's all building upon itself. And next time, we'll look at Gemini, and we'll eventually get to Apollo. Do all that. And if you're interested in this stuff, like I said, I've covered SpaceX, I've covered the Chinese space program, and I will get to the Soviet space program with a little bit of luck. Anyway, really look forward to doing this video. So, if you join me with it, I greatly appreciate it. But with that, my voice is giving out. So, I think I'll call it a night. This is Misha, and I'm really surprised the kittens haven't joined me for this. There's a lot of little fun things they could have played with. I definitely didn't wait to record this once Calypso crashed out in the bed. Nope. And I definitely didn't feed Peanut a whole can of cat food to make her zonk out too. Anyway, catch you very soon next time.